Hello, everyone. I'm assuming you're a student of constitutional history, and I'm assuming that you had the determination and technological skill to be able to navigate not only through the events going on in the world, but also the technology that we're changing to. So, thank you very much for your determination and your skill and your willingness to continue on. And there's a lot to learn. So I'm going to do the best I can in the next several videos and the next several weeks to cover all or most of the material that we were going to cover. So I'm just going to focus today on the continuation of our unit on discrimination. As you recall, before all the craziness happened, we looked at a mini unit for a class or two on gender discrimination, focusing largely on women. And now we're going to pivot and move forward and take a look at issues related to nationality. We're going to look at nationality and alienage. We're going to talk about what those mean. We're going to look at Native Americans and some of the constitutional issues that have sort of been involved in that history. And I'm going to just give you kind of some highlights and maybe some philosophical questions too, related to those issues and integrating with some of the reading you did for this unit. So we're going to move ahead here. Let's see if I can get this to work. I'm sure it's going to work. Let's see. There it is. Okay. All right. So what you're going to see here at the bottom of the screen is a picture of Americans. These are Americans that came to our country about 100 years ago. And one of the things that I want to draw your attention to had to do with something going on in our national history. You may or may not remember from maybe a global history or an American history course that 1906 marked a significant transition in American history. It was the largest influx of immigrants to date. That's in terms of heads per capita. And many of these new immigrants to the United States came from China, but most of them came from Eastern Europe at this point. There are a lot of things going on in the world, in that area of the world, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, for example. A lot of people being sort of mistreated and run off their lands. Borders were changing. There were pogroms and repressive policies, discriminatory policies there. And so with the promise of a better life and maybe that would be sort of the pull factor towards something better, and the push factor would be fleeing persecution or sort of dead-end destinies in some of the areas that they were in. Regardless of those reasons, there are lots and lots of voices in this new wave of immigration. This is after many waves from Europe and some from Asia on the west coast. So the newest ones were from Eastern Europe and Russia and those sort of areas. So one of the things that is important to keep in mind about this from a historical perspective is the sheer number of people who are coming into these large eastern cities in the United States, largely eastern cities. We can look at the West in just a moment. So New York, Boston, Philadelphia in particular. So that means that cities were already swelling, and now we have just huge new waves and new neighborhoods and new challenges and issues, and raising some questions. What does it mean to be an American if a huge percentage of these people, or increasing percentage, don't speak English, might not be Christian, don't know anything about American history? So that led some political-minded bureaucrats to start policies known as Americanization. So by our standards, this might seem very outdated and regressive, but it was really considered progressive. It's a way of kind of leaning forward and trying to incorporate and integrate new people. So Americanization, if you might recall, had to do with a multi-pronged policy. One, to educate people, teach them English, teach them American history, things like that, and also health and how to get a job and things like that. So this is hugely influential on what it means to be an American and how you can become an American. So, and again, raising all sorts of big, good questions about that. So this is around, in the wave of this came a backlash. A lot of what were called nativists back then, or Native Americans, not to be confused with Indians, American Indians, people who considered themselves to be native-born Americans, sometimes called true Americans, some people would say. They said, we need to stop that. We need to come up with a quota system at least, and limit the people who come in so that there are only really good reasons why they come in, not just because they want to. So there have to be like fleeing, they're refugees fleeing from persecution, and we need to come up with a bureaucracy known as the INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service, to screen that and to oversee that. So this, again, is still with us. This is history today, in a sense. So by 1900, about a quarter of those that new wave of immigrants were from China. I mean, China, even the concept of a modern China was a relatively new one. It really wasn't, many people didn't even consider it sort of a single unitary nation. It was just sort of an area in which a lot of people spoke similar languages, Chinese, Mandarin, and a variety of other dialects. And so some of those started coming in waves to the American West. Okay, if you're following me so far, you'll see that this links up with one of the readings we did for this unit. So the Chinese, as we know, suffered very different conditions than those in the eastern United States, both de facto and de jure discrimination. So in some, as an example, the railway labor conditions as the transcontinental railway was built, many of these people were treated just terribly, in terrible conditions, and just in terms of labor, but also in terms of like racism. But that, again, that's sort of as a matter of fact, that's what de facto means, as opposed to de jure, which is where the law gets involved, and law creates discrimination against these people. These are, in terms of the Chinese, these are sometimes called the laundry laws, which we're going to turn our attention to now. So that brings us to still kind of a leading case, an important case called Yick-Wo versus Hopkins. And so if you recall, back in the late 19th century, if you remember the reading from this, what came of this was a decision in which the court was dealing with these so-called laundry laws. So these were laws in civic areas, cities, and communities that would restrict people's businesses, laundry businesses. It was a covert way of getting at controlling Chinese immigrants or Chinese Americans, because they were largely restricted to these kind of professions. So if you could restrict how a laundry building was constructed, you could control when they can run their business, and you can therefore kind of restrict competition for other sort of nativist stores, if you're following me there. And so one of the outcomes of that case was that the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, ends up protecting people in a jurisdiction, not just citizens. This becomes really interesting. By the time we're done with our mini unit on nationality, you'll see how this has come about. So that is a really interesting idea, right? So that means that it's not just American citizens or just people in the jurisdiction, or just citizens, but it's anyone who comes into America that is protected. Now, this has not been applied uniformly across all issues, but you'll see this becomes kind of an interesting issue that many contemporary Americans probably don't know about. And remember, in this particular case, the Yick-Wo versus Hopkins, the court said that the intent of the laundry laws was discriminatory. It is what they would later call a suspect classification. They also, again, this sounds kind of progressive for 1886. The court found that these laws showed malice towards foreigners. Again, that was really before the big wave crashed over America by 1900, 1906. But you still see this interest in looking at the effects of the laws, not just the the right to make these laws. It's also what happens when you apply these laws, and that is to show malice towards foreigners. Also, in that decision, if you recall, they talk about the regulation of local or state property laws, and they use the word capricious. Capricious means sort of without some rationality. In other words, it's done on a whim. So it doesn't seem to be grounded in lots of jurisprudence or legal precedent or stare decisis. It's, we don't like these Chinese, and so we're going to try to restrict them. So even way back in 1886, a court was interested in those issues. We turn to one of the darker times in our American history here, World War II. And not just the World War II, which was dark enough, the Holocaust and some of the terrible conditions that soldiers and civilians suffered, but also here on the home front. And so we looked at, in a time of panic, and this is something that maybe we might resonate with now. We're not panicking. I don't hear anyone panicking, but at a time of crisis and concern, that the powers of the federal government sometimes expand. They will later contract when the crisis is over. And so at a time of panic and concern, when American territory had been attacked in Pearl Harbor in December 7th, 1941, we find very soon after that, the President FDR instilled this Executive Order 9066, a notorious one, which resulted in something like 30 to 100,000 American citizens on the West Coast rounded up and put in internment camps. This was a wartime mentality, and there was maybe even hysteria as a result of this, the attack. Many people, even at the time, saw this as a restriction on civil rights. There's this new organization called the War Relocation Authority that was set up to organize this. But here's an interesting thing that you probably don't know. Most people at Roberts don't know this. I happen to know some of these quirky little things about our history. That in the 1940s, one of the things that Roberts Wesleyan College then considered, Chesbrough Seminary, was involved in, is finding some of these Japanese American students and bringing them here to North Chilai in order to protect them from the internment camps. There's a kind of a loophole or something. 50 years later, some of the surviving students came back in a reunion. This would have been 50 years after mid-1940s, so mid-90s, I think. And they had this interesting little ceremony that no one really has recorded. It's a very, very sort of under the radar, interesting little story that Roberts has to tell. But in the executive order, of course, in the broader sense, what happens, again, police powers during a crisis confronts these bedrock notions of civil rights, the guarantee of the 14th Amendment. So obviously raise some questions about what it means to be an American. So if you're an American and your parents come from Japan, don't you have the right to be treated the same way as anyone else? Well, many of us would probably say here in a time that we're not at war, of course. But at this time, when a lot of things were happening very quickly, there's a lot to process in the lead up to war, that this was issued, which leads us to the next panel. So I'm gonna stop here. We're gonna pause, and I'll see you on the other side in another video. So I'm gonna pause right here, and we'll pick up this story in the next one.